Yes, hello everybody, colleagues, friends, Austrian presidency. We are very grateful to be here. It's actually personally, I think it's the third Austrian presidency I've attended, so that shows that we are getting older, some of us at least. What I'm going to speak to you about here today is a project we are running. It's called The Changing Role and Nature of Vocational Education Training. And I will take you through the observations of this project to try to show you what are the tendencies, what are actually the challenges. It relates, of course, to what has been said here previously today, but try to go a little bit deeper into the developments of European vocational education training in the last, well, basically 20 years, but also then eventually trying to look a little bit ahead. And I will start by the competing stories about vocational education and training, the opposing expectations to vocational education training. There is a negative story which says that vocational education training is declining, it's losing out to general and academic education and training. We also heard a story, I don't know why this is moving, that was not the purpose. I need to be in control of this. The second one is that the skills provided by the current vocational education training system are less in need due to digitalization, due to the polarization of work. I mean, quite serious challenges regarding the vocational education training system. On the other hand, and we have heard that today, here we have the positive story, the positive expectations to vocational education training. Some point, and I will show you later, VET is actually expanding to higher levels. We see that VET in many cases, in many countries, actually form the backbone of emerging lifelong learning. And I think many argue that skills provided by the vocational education training sector are essential for continued economic growth and for upholding welfare. I think that's strong arguments. So in a way, there's a negative story and there's a positive story. The basis of what I'm speaking about here is a project CEDEFOP is running. It's called The Changing Nature and Role of VET in Europe. When we started this project back in 2014, 2015, we felt there was a need to take a step back to look at what is actually happening here. What are the challenges? What are the dynamics in vocational education and training in Europe? And we are doing two things. First of all, we are looking back. We are looking at what has happened in vocational education training in Europe in the last, well, 20 years, 25 years, from the 90s and onwards to today, to see, well, what kind of developments, what kind of dynamics do we see in the European VET sector? But we're also trying to look forward. We are trying to develop scenarios which will help us to illustrate directions of travel and the choices implied in these directions of travels, because there are different directions of travels possible here. It's not only one, there are many. And I think the project, and again, I'm out of control here, is to try to look at both, look backwards, but also forwards. We will actually come back to this issue in November 2018, because the final conference of this project will be during the VET week. And there we will present also these scenarios and the thinking behind those. So we will continue. So this event here today is sort of a first taste, a first pilot in a way regarding this project. I think I also need to underline that this is not something CEDEFOP doing internally by our internal staff. It is really heavily linked to the research community in Europe. We have a core team of researchers from Austria, from Denmark, from Estonia, from Italy, and also from the UK, which are very important. But I would also like to say that, I'm not sure what's happening here. Also say that in addition to this core team, we have experts in all the 30 countries which we are covering, the EU 28, plus Norway and Iceland. So in a way, I think the project and what we are doing here is to try to connect to the research community and really build on the experiences of researchers working professionally and systematically on vocational education training. I think that has worked well, and just to mention that the project leader for the consortium is Jörg Markowitz from 3S here in Vienna, so Austria is well represented. So, let's go into this. I first want to speak a little bit about what I call the heartland, initial vocational education training at basically the EQF levels 3 and 4. That is what we traditionally see as vocational education training. And I think this brings us back to this, what I call the negative story, declining vocational education training in Europe. And these are the aggregate European statistics. We see that back from the 90s and until 2015. And that seems to, in a way, confirm the declining role of vocational education training. From an absolute top in 2005 of over 60%, we saw in 15 around 47%. So a decline, it seems. And these figures also seem to be confirmed by other aggregated figures from, for example, UNESCO. So, in a way, this seems to show that there is a kind of a threat towards vocational education training. This was also one of the reasons, I think, why we started this project. We really wanted to look behind these figures, these aggregated figures. What is actually happening? So what did we do? Well, we went back to the national statistics and we looked at what have actually been happening in vocational education training. In a way, reconstructing developments over this period. And what we see then is interesting because it shows a much more diverse picture than this kind of steady decline which comes out of these aggregated figures. First of all, and I think that's interesting, we see a remarkable growth in some countries. Hungary, Portugal, Spain, Greece, although from a low base. The starting point is low, but we see a remarkable strengthening. What we see is also a significant or moderate decline in some countries. And that, of course, is in particular in the big countries like Germany, in France, where we see a clear decline, but although from a very high base. You can also observe moderate growth from a medium-high level in some other countries like Austria, Finland, Netherlands, Sweden. So, in a way, what is the picture here is that in the majority of European countries, we either observe growth or we observe stability. In some countries, however, there is a decline. And of course, the fact that these bigger countries see a decline from a high level, of course, influences the aggregate figures. So, in a way, what we also see is that initial vocational education training at these levels actually uphold its position quite well in relation to general, the upper secondary education. Vocational education training actually seems to be quite strong, relatively speaking, in relation to the general. So the picture here is diverse. And I think we need to see that European vocational education training consists of, in this case, 30 different national systems. And these systems develop in different ways. So we need to be very careful in kind of judging the whole continent on the basis of this aggregated figure, because the figures behind here are much more complex. They show a much more diverse developments, which are both positive and negative. This diversity also comes back when we look at the delivery of vocational education training at these levels. And we use this term in our reports. Initial vocational education training is actually impressively diverse in Europe. The majority of European VET students, as of now, follow actually more what we could call a school-based approach to vocational education training. Of course, with varying input of practice-based learning. Again, there's diversity, but I think it's right to say that the majority of European IVET students follows a more school-based approach. But then we have a significant minority, there should be minority of VET students follow a dual apprenticeship-based model. So I think it's important. The big reality here is that the school-based system actually stands quite strong in Europe, but with an increasing element of practice work-based elements. What we also see, and that is perhaps just at the beginning, is that we see tendencies that systems move in a more lifelong learning direction, combining diverse approaches, and that is important, and I will come back to that later, allowing adults to enter the initial vocational education training system. I think that is really a significant development, that systems are opening up from this kind of 16 to 20-year age group to actually opening up to adults. So again here we see that there is a kind of pluralistic development. where even dominating delivery models are complemented by alternatives form of learning. So we see the number of different programs is actually increasing and complementing existing main models. So diversity has increased in the 2 decades. It's not like we are going towards one single or a few single. Actually, it's going the different direction. And that brings us, of course, to some questions here about also policies, because what we see now in the current VET systems is basically national control, but we also see European international convergences, and I want to say something about that. I think overall, vocational education training now currently in Europe is a national responsibility. Compared to higher education, the Bologna process, we have seen much less this kind of institutional qualification harmonization. We don't find common VET qualifications, common VET institutions, degrees in Europe in the same way as we have seen for higher education. Of course, that has both good and bad sides. Of course, this national control ensures local, regional, and national adaptation and relevance. But of course, and I think we need to be aware of that, there's also a risk for a kind of a lock-in effect where not the optimal solutions are chosen. So I think that, in a way, focuses on what has been the Copenhagen process, the cooperation at European level. How do we systematically cooperate? And that is quite interesting, because if we look at the 2 decades we have been looking at, we actually see some very interesting convergences, which in a way are not linked to the common qualifications or institutions, but to other aspects. So let's look at some of these convergences, because I think they are quite important. And what we're doing here is to look at vocational education training from 3 angles. First of all, we are looking at the institutions, the systems. What is happening to the systems, institutions? We are then looking at the content, what kind of pedagogical content changes, and we are also then finally looking at the more kind of socio-economic, the link to the labor market, how what is changing. And I think we see quite strong convergences happening in these different areas. And just to summarize very briefly, if you look back to 1995, and it doesn't really sound very far away, it's just, 23 years ago. What we saw then at that point was the provision of VET at that time was more fragmented, very strong link to industry and sectors, and weaker links to the overall education and training system. We saw much more the dead-end programs restricted to medium levels with little progression to higher levels. The permeability was weaker. We saw that VET was very narrowly defined as initial VET for this 16 to 20-year group. And we also saw that this kind of influenced the overall system. So what has happened in these 20 years? I think what we have seen, and that's perhaps an important finding from our project, is that we see much more coherent VET systems which are strongly integrated into the overall education training system. There's been a number of reforms in the countries trying to do that, to place vocational education training firmly in the overall education training, and also ensuring this kind of permeability, the progress route between VET and other parts of education training. So increased permeability, fewer dead ends is clearly the case. We also see that this has consequences for the qualifications, both how the qualifications are defined, but also how they are organized. So more centralized, or I would say nationalized standards are being set, less in the industries themselves. We see fewer qualifications, broadened profiles. The number of qualifications has clearly gone down in many countries. And I would say the diversification of target groups, including adults, is also a very important aspect. It's not only the 16 to 19-year group, it's also a much bigger group of target groups which are focused by the VET system. So in a way, these are quite significant changes. So perhaps perhaps we should expect more changes. We have heard about how rapidly change is happening, but still, if you look at the details there, these are quite significant changes. It changes, so to say, the core of VET in very important ways. And I think this integration into the overall education training system, the reforms, in a way strengthening permeability here, is actually quite important, and is something we actually can observe very clearly in our studies. So then what about content, pedagogics? What we saw, of course, was that in the 90s, VET and general education was conceptually very distinct, very different. We could also see that the work-based learning elements actually were underdeveloped in the parts of VET which were outside the apprenticeship systems. The school-based VET had sort of underdeveloped work-based, practice-based learning. And much of the school-based VET, in a way, I think we could say, was input-driven, weakly linked to more weakly linked to labor markets, and that in a way you could see programs qualification were highly specialized and specific. What we see now in 15 is that we see a crossing of boundaries, more a crossing of boundaries. Some call it a blurring of lines between school, workplace, general, vocational. And I think that is also linked to this increased permeability, that you get new programs which combine vocational general education training. You see also that the content related to general education influences VET and vice versa. So we also see that there's increased work-based learning element in almost all IVET forms. And I think that's important because we see that the school-based vocational education training now increasingly is taking on board also the lessons from the apprenticeship system, emphasizing the importance of work-based and practice-based learning. We also see, and that is very clear, a reorientation to learning outcomes and competences, a very strong element. So when you define your qualification, you define it according to what you expect a candidate to know, to be able to do and to understand, not based on the input, the duration, the location. And that's been a very important, a very strong development in European VET. We also see more flexibility in time and place of learning, increasing acceptance of prior learning, validation, recognition of prior learning. So these are quite important changes. And the final one, which is then linked to the socioeconomic context, the link to the labor market. It's a little bit the same, perhaps go a little bit quicker through this in a way, more limited goals, preparing for job entry, securing skilled labor. So it was also much more industry sector-based. We also had a more stronger focus perhaps on medium-level skills. And of course, digitalization played much smaller, lesser role than what we see today. What we see now here today, or let's say 2 decades after, are broader goals. Social as well as economic, excellence as well as integration. Increasing role of skills intelligence systems. This is something which is now coming much stronger in the VET system. The need to work on forecasting, skills intelligence, try to forecast better what is coming, what are the tendencies. Of course, at the negative side is this issue, jobs requiring middle-level skills. In some cases, some sector declining. Future developments are contested, digitalization now a key driving force. So, of course, it illustrates the challenges ahead. So this gives you a snapshot of very important changes we see over these two and a half decades, anyway, both in relation to the systems, but also related to the content and in relation to the link to the labor market. So in a way, this broadening, this diversification, the integration into the education training system in general, perhaps the blurring of lines, are quite important issues. So in a way, initial vocational education training is less specialized, it's broadening, it's in a way trying to reach wider groups of candidates, individuals, both in terms of age, but also in regards to their position in the labor market. That were a few words about initial vocational education training. Of course, this is a very important part of the overall VET systems. I mean, we are speaking about almost 50% of all upper secondary school students, pupils. So, I mean, we are really speaking about a very important part of society and of education training systems. But I will now take you into how is vocationally oriented education training developing? Because it's not only a question about initial vocational education training at these level 3 and 4, which the kind of medium level skills. Because vocational education training, oriented education training is clearly moving into new territories. So the issue here is what is happening to continuing to higher vocational education and training. And perhaps one of the most important and significant developments we see now is vocationally oriented education training at higher levels, at what we can call EQF levels 5 and up to 8, actually. And I think what we are speaking about here is a change in the conception of vocational education training. I think traditionally we've been thinking about VET as something linked to the medium level, to the EQF levels 3 and 4. And I think that has to change. It is changing. And we see that, for example, VET at post-secondary level, what we could call EQF 5, has significantly increased in the last decade and more. I mean, we have very clear examples of that. The Netherlands, France, could mention many examples. So that's the EQF 5 is becoming more important. We also see, and that's interesting, if we look at higher education in general, university courses, this kind of drive towards including, integrating practice work-based elements is becoming more important. What we, in our project, I call a sort of a vocational drift. We see examples of this, and there is a constant discussion here in a way between what we call academic drift, vocational drift. To what extent should work-based elements, practice-based elements also be integrated into the traditional university study? So that's an important part of the vocational discussion. We also see that a lot of countries actually uphold what we call a binary higher education sector with a clear role given to institutions with a vocational or professional orientation. This is important. We also see an emergence of new vocationally oriented institutions outside traditional higher education university sector. I don't have the time to go into this, but the point is that this is probably one of the really important developments when we speak about vocationally oriented education, this expansion into higher levels. And the question is how do we actually follow that? How do we strengthen it? How do we work with this? I think there's, perhaps I'll just go straight to what I see as key challenges here. And I think one of the key challenges related to the higher vocational education training is actually the visibility. Because a lot of these developments which I indicated in the previous slide are actually not that visible in the debate. And I think to make this more visible, what is actually happening, to make more visible this challenge between the vocational, the academic drift, what is the role of, let's say, practice-based learning in universities? What is the role of vocational professional education at high level? Do we need new institutions is really a very, very important issue. And of course, that links us directly into this issue of how do we strengthen the permeability of system, how do we remove the dead ends, how can we create real progression in vocational education training, not leaving people in a situation of dead ends at medium level, but actually making it possible for them to move throughout life and make opportunities from the whole education training system. But also this focus on practice-based, work-based learning. I will just say a few words, and this is of course a big issue. It's about the adults, about adults and vocational learning in a way. We have, I must confess, quite big problems in statistics, in the data as regards continuing vocational education. This is a continuous problem we have in a way. How do you actually observe what is happening in the society in terms of continuing vocational education and training, which is very important. what we see is that the companies play a key role for continuing vocational education training. But as I also have said, the adults, the fact that we see many of the initial or ARQA-VET systems actually opening up to adults, that is probably a very important part of that you get this shift towards a more lifelong learning oriented initial vocational education training systems. You also see some tensions here, key dimensions in ARQA-VET. Is it specialized? Is it going towards more general issues? We have been doing some studies in sector. We have 3 sector cases in the retail. We have machine manufacturing. We see also ICT, and of course see very big differences. Retail is a very good example of this polarization I mentioned at the very beginning, that a lot of the CVT goes to the higher levels, but almost nothing to the lower level. So you get the kind of polarization. Situation in ICT is very different, where we see actually a tendency from specialization to require more general and deeper knowledge. So situation in sectors context matters a lot when we speak about continuing vocational education training. What we have done as part of the project, and I just will give you a short glimpse into this, we have had a survey across Europe to VET experts, VET stakeholders, what is their view on the past, what is their view on future trends. We have so far got more than 1,300 responses, and we are just at the very start of looking at these. And I just give you a short glimpse into this. So what do these people, or many of you actually are here, I guess, actually mean about what are the key past trends in the 95-2015? A very significant kind of observation from all of you is that the shift to learning outcomes competences actually has changed quite a lot. Also, that the shift towards higher vocationally oriented education training is very significant, and also that the work-based elements are key. That seems to be the general agreement across national borders, that these aspects are quite important. However, there's also, at the negative side, the patterns of enrollment, and also the dead ends still are problems. The kind of patterns of enrollment, I mean, that's of course focused in some countries. You have now more problems with the recruitment, but as I said, the diversity is perhaps bigger here. So what about the future trends? It's a little bit different. I think most of you then think that the growth or the expansion toward higher levels is going to continue. The work-based elements also, and also the kind of responsiveness to labor market needs is a key issue. Again, we see a little bit the same negative issue, stable patterns of enrollment and decreasing numbers of training places as kind of key issues. So just a kind of a taste. There seems to be a broad agreement on these kind of top levels developments changes, but we see also these kind of negative aspects. I will go a little bit quicker fast, because we asked you, well, if you have 3 choices, what kind of priorities, how would you like to see vocational education training? What would be the kind of focus you would like to see developed into vocational education training in the future? Quite interesting here is that what came out on top here is actually to prepare students to fully participate in society and become active citizens. So a very general objective. This actually contrasted the responses to well, what have you seen in the past, where the focus was much more on the second one, that you should prepare students for working life in a specific occupation or occupational field. So a bit of tension here in a way. Should VET in a way develop in a more general level to take care of the whole kind of the whole profile of a citizen, or should it be more specialized? So, but again, these results will be prepared now in the coming time. Some tensions we see, but you see in a way you can see this graph as kind of a definition of what we see as vocational education training, what we would wish vocational education training should be in the future. I'm now coming towards the end, and that has to do with directions of travel and implications of these directions of travel. What we are doing, and we will actually have a workshop here in Vienna now on Wednesday about these scenarios, and that is, I will just also give you a taste of this discussion. This is not finalized, we are still really at the point of discussions, but it might help you to see some of the possible directions of travel. And what we have been doing is to try to make two very distinct models of the future development of vocational education training. And I will start with one, which we can call the directional travel, the distinctive model. And what is this distinctive model? If we start with the position of it in the wider education and training system, is a vocational education training which is organized around professions. In Austria, we would call it linked to the Beruf. Clearly distinguished from other forms of education by its close relationship to enterprises and sector. And what is VET for then? It's focus on professional entry, associated with medium to high skilled professions. What type of pathways, work-based learning, apprenticeships have high status, is sort of a gold standard of vocational learning. It would be very much employer focused in a way. And how is the kind of broad understanding of VET? Well, VET is understood as a clearly defined subsector consisting of clearly defined institutions. So the key word we have sort of say extracted here, it's sort of a modernized version of vocational training. So that is one side. Then we have the other one, which we call a more pluralistic model. And if we start at the top again, so while in a way this model, the pluralistic model, have close link to the labor market, VET is moving closer to other parts of education training, in a way in line with what I've sort of say described for the period. So so in a way, who is then VET for? Well, we see increasing diversity of target groups, covering lower levels as well as medium and higher levels. So it's much a broader range of target group. And what type of pathways? Well, what we see is numerous VET pathways operating side by side. School and work-based pathways have the same status and is mixed pragmatically, a much more diverse approach. What types of provision? Well, a widening variety of provision. And what is our understanding of that? VET is then understood as a feature and function, not as a particular set of institutions. VET is relevant to all levels and types of education, training and learning, and the key word here would be towards vocationally oriented learning. So institutional, much more wide, pluralistic, less clear perhaps, but in a way perhaps more responding to what we have seen in the 2 years. And I don't want to go into detail. This just shows in a way the model we are working on, which we will work on now on Wednesday and in the months now coming. And there is one, you could see, horizontal line, and that's the one I've described. It's the one between the pluralistic developments and the more distinctive profession-oriented education training. But we also have a vertical line, and we have used the terms vocational drift, academic drift to say something about that, because these are real tensions in our education training system. Is there a focus more on the work-based learning, on the practice-based learning, or is there more focus on the more theoretical knowledge side? How is this mixed? What are the tensions? How do we mix these? And this will have an impact on the way we develop our system. So this is a starting point for discussion to show different possible directions of travel and the implications of that. So again, just at the start, but just to give you an indication. Our project, we hope, will be a catalyst for reflection and development. So far, we have published 3 reports. 2 of them have been in printed version outside here. The third one was put online last week, so you can have a look at that. That looks at how vocational education training actually is influenced by external factors, technology, demographics, economic issues. How is VET responding to vocational education training? That is also accompanied with a set of case studies. So please go and have a look at that. I'm sure you will find quite interesting material. And that was the end of it, and thank you for your attention. And the material is available on our website. We will continue this. We will also meet many of you in November on the final conference. So thank you very much.